Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Brendan Bohannan, Associate Professor of Biology, specializing in microbial ecology and evolution. Brendan Bohannan earned his BS in biology at Humboldt State and his PhD in microbiology at Michigan State. He came to Oregon in 2006 after teaching at Stanford, and in Oregon he heads the Bohannan Research Group and is a member of the Center for Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Brendan Bohannan's research focuses on the diversity of microorganisms and the causes and consequences of that biodiversity. He's especially interested in promoting the integration of microbial ecology into the general science of ecology. It's great to have you with us today.
It's my pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
Tell us why microbes are important to us. Can't see them. You may have one or two with you. Do you today?
Well, I have some plush representations of microbes with me today, which I can pull out in a little bit. But microbes are important for us for a number of reasons. I mean, we think of them primarily as our adversaries, as pathogens, and that's certainly one important aspect of microbial life. But they're also intimately involved in our health. So one factoid I often share with my students is that we have 10 times more microbial cells in us and on us than we have human cells. So in a way, we're kind of a walking ecosystem, community of little things as well as our own cells. And it's just becoming clear really in the last 5 or 10 years how important that community is, that ecosystem, in terms of promoting our own health. So that's one reason. And microbes are intimately involved in the global processes that sustain all life on Earth. So the recycling of nutrients that allows life to continue on Earth. And the destruction of our garbage and the recreation and recycling of that into things that we can use.
So we're talking about both inside the human body and then outside in the world as a whole.
Exactly.
They play a very big role.
And for our inner space as well as across the globe.
So how did you get interested yourself in microbes, and when did you make this kind of switch in seeing them as friendly creatures instead of something to be concerned about?
And, most people, I think, when you ask them a question like that, it's not quite clear exactly when it was, but I can remember the moment, actually. So I dropped out of my undergraduate career fairly early to take a position promoting organic agriculture in California. I ended up running California's organic agricultural certification program. And there were a couple farmers that I thought were really ahead of the curve that I worked with. And one of them told me, I don't farm plants, I farm microbes. And the microbes farm my plants. And I remember that moment thinking, I don't know what that means, but that sounds fascinating. And so that was the seed that was planted in my mind.
And can you interpret that for us now?
Certainly. Yeah. So there's different approaches to agriculture, of course, to producing human food. And one traditional chemical agricultural approach is to treat the soil as essentially a sponge. You put the chemical nutrients in to the sponge, plants take them out, and that's how you grow plants for food. Another approach is one that takes into account more of the ecology of the soil. It treats the soil as a living entity, and you promote its health and its natural fertility, and that natural fertility feeds the plants. And that was the approach that organic farmers were using, and they had to use really, because to produce food without chemical fertilizers, you have to take advantage of that natural living component of the soil.
So then you did this job as, say again what your
title was? I was the certification program coordinator for California Certified Organic Farmers. Right. So I was sort of a U.S. Marshal in Organic County. So I had inspectors that worked for me.
So, well, let's talk about that for a moment.
Okay.
So where have we come to? Where have we gotten to from that point? From that point when you began, are we going in a positive direction with organic farming in the United States?
Yeah. I think so. I've been out of the business for a while. Talk about things more, my work more recently, but I think we've gone in a great direction. So when I was involved was the period of time in the late 80s and early 90s when big farmers were starting to make the transition. They saw the economic benefits of converting to organic agriculture, as well as the social and environmental benefits of moving to that form of agriculture. And so that propelled the industry forward in a big way. And with it has come problems of scale as well in the commercialization of organic agriculture. But in general, I think that's been a good direction. And now, more recently, I have students here at Oregon who have been very interested in the recent offshoots of that. So the local food movement and the real food movement, as it's called, eating things that are closer to the original plants and less processed. And all those I think of as the children of this original organic movement in the U.S.
So let's move now to some of your more current, the microbes. So you say the biologists know a lot about the diversity of plants and animals on Earth, but not much about microbial diversity. So I guess one of the reasons is it's harder to see.
That's right.
Yeah. Are we doing better now, though, in learning about it? And tell us what the importance of learning about it is.
Certainly. So we are doing better. Initially, we knew so much less about microbial diversity than plant and animal diversity because we were restricted to only understanding the microbes that we could keep in captivity. So it would be like understanding the plant and animal world only through those things we could grow in greenhouses easily, keep in zoos. Because the only way to study microbes were to bring them into the laboratory, to culture them as individual entities, and then to study them in that way. And it turns out we only have a tiny fraction of microbial diversity on Earth can we approach in that way, that we can keep in captivity. So then 15 or so years ago, this idea that one could study microbes through their genetic footprints in the environment became popular. It was launched as an approach. And that's one of the approaches that we use in my lab. And that's much more comprehensive. You go to the environment, extract nucleic acids from soil or from water, and then look for certain genes that are indicative of certain types of microbes. And in that way, we don't look at them directly, but we look for their genetic footprints that are left in soil or water or other environments.
Now, tell me again what you mean by a genetic footprint.
So certain
that gets left behind.
Exactly. Yeah. So in each microbe, there's a genome. There are chromosomes that code for enzymes that are necessary for their living, for the lifestyle that they have metabolically, and we can isolate those particular genes that are responsible for that metabolism from this gamish of DNA we can extract from soil and water. And so those are their genetic footprints. So we're not looking at individuals, but we're looking at the sea of genes and picking out the genes that are unique to those types. So we're kind of studying the biodiversity of genes, and from that inferring the biodiversity of species.
But again, explain to me, so where is the gene? I mean, you look in the soil, the microbes are gone. Or they're in there.
Oh, they're in there.
They're in there.
Yeah, and so what we do is to take the soil and to treat it horribly. We freeze it and warm it and beat it up with little tiny glass beads and break up all the biological material, the cells that are in the soil, for example, or water sample for that matter. And then we purify the genes that are inside the organisms that have now been released into the samples. Right. And then from that mix of genes, there's molecular biology tricks we can use that will isolate single types from that mix of genes.
So tell me what you've been learning, and tell me the significance of it for ecology. And maybe you could. I think most people know what ecology is, but you may have a different definition of it.
Certainly. Well, I think I have a fairly common definition, but it's a recent science, so there definitely has a variety of definitions, and it's a word that's used in a popular sense in ways that are not that don't overlap quite a bit with the scientific definition. So my definition of ecology is it's the study of the causes and consequences of the variety of life. So why is there such a variety of forms of life on Earth, and what are the consequences of that variety? So ecologists study how organisms interact with their environment, how that determines the distribution of life, how they interact with other creatures, how that determines the composition of communities, and then they study ecosystems, so large-scale cycling of nutrients, and that's a consequence of this variety of life. And what I'm interested in is where microbes fit into that broader science. And one of the things that we've learned that's been the most controversial is that there are certain rules or general principles that seem to apply across all of life. Plants, animals, even the tiniest forms of living creatures. And one of those rules is that that communities tend to, aggregations or groups of organisms tend to be more similar when they're close together in space than when they're farther apart. And that similarity declines with distance in a certain characteristic way. And that seems to be true of plants and of animals and of microbes.
So when similar kinds of species, is that what you want to call it, or similar kinds of organisms, are very close together.
In space. Yeah.
In space, they tend to resemble each other.
That's right.
And then as they get further apart, so a microbe in Oregon is going to be different from a microbe in New York?
That's
or
the
in
idea.
Afghanistan?
Exactly, and that's a very controversial idea, because for
see.
most of the history of microbiology, there was this idea that microbes can fly easily all over the world.
I see.
And so, excuse me, space doesn't really matter for them. But we found that that's not necessarily true, and they're much like plants and animals. So we have a unique Oregon flora, and it's different than New York, for example, and it seems like there at least now there's the suggestion that we have some evidence that we could have unique microbes in Oregon that one would not find in New York.
So if you're thinking of the bad microbes, or the ones that might be responsible for disease, this would seem to have a lot of implications for treating disease.
Yeah, exactly. Though that's a little bit of a different situation, because those microbes get carried by us. And we're very mobile creatures, so we can distribute them quite quickly around the world. Yeah. But if one, for example, is looking for microbes that carry an antibiotic, something unique that we haven't discovered before, then this idea that microbes differ in space is very important.
Climate change. You're looking at how global change influences microbial life. Can you tell us of what you think the study of microbes can help to illuminate about global warming, for example?
Be happy to. So this is a question I'm particularly excited about right now. And in many ecosystems, their response to climate change is dependent on below ground processes. So what happens below the dirt? The plant communities that most people are very interested in respond to climate change in various ways, but what happens below ground is very important. We don't really understand much of those processes, and most of those processes are mediated by microbes. So understanding how microbes respond to climate change might help us understand how plant communities and animal communities respond to climate change. And we're just beginning to do that.
I see.
So unlocking that box.
So tell us about what's going on under the ground exactly. And give me an idea. You talk about microbes that are under the ground that are neither. Well, what sort of life are they? I mean, what are microbes? Are they? I mean, what? I mean, in relation to plants and animals.
Sure.
They're sub.
So they're unique forms of life. What defines a microbe is really its size in many ways. People have different definitions for microbe depending on the microbiologist you talk to, but the most common ones have to do with size. And for some microbiologists, it means very small things that are single-celled, so they don't have tissues the way we do or plants do. Or more broadly, it's things that are so small they don't need an organ system like we have to transport food and fluids around, or like plants have with their phloem and xylem. But the general definition is certainly things that are tiny.
Things that are tiny.
Right. And those include the bacteria, so very small, single-celled creatures, the archaea that look sort of like bacteria, but are evolutionarily and physiologically very different. And then tiny eukaryotes, so things closer related to us, the fungi and protists, things like that.
So tell me again what the significance of looking under the ground and seeing what happens there has to do with understanding what happens above the ground.
Sure. So plants are fixing carbon from the atmosphere, taking CO2 in, using light as a source of energy, producing plant material, and that plant material has a fate. It ends up on the ground and then in the ground. And then it gets recycled below ground by microbes. And often the long-term response of an ecosystem to change, like climate change, depends on those processes of recycling under the soil.
I see.
And those processes are, by and large, all performed by microorganisms, by fungi, bacteria, archaea. So understanding how they are altered by climate change is very important, because that determines how nutrients are recycled, how much nutrient is lost from an ecosystem, how much is recycled back into plants. And over years, that can make a huge difference.
And how advanced is this science now of figuring out what's going on under the ground to see what's happening above and what the future may hold for the human beings?
Well, I'd like to think it's very advanced.
It's advanced right now?
Certainly. I mean, there's always new challenges. Essentially, what we do with below ground samples to study the response to climate change is to treat the soil sort of like we treat humans, as having a genome. So the Human Genome Project was has been very important in understanding human biology, and was a huge, big undertaking for a number of years. And we essentially perform the same kind of analysis on soil. We look at its content of genes and try to understand response to climate change from that. So specifically, we're looking at genes from organisms that are involved in cycling of nitrogen, for example, converting nitrogen from forms that plants can't use to forms that plants can use.
Can you tell the sort of layperson out there some very concrete conclusions that we can understand as a result of this research and the other kind of questions you might be looking at? Very concrete.
Sure. So one observation that we've made, one discovery, is that stimulated climate change. So if we change a current ecosystem in a way that's likely to be the kind of change they will experience in 50 years or so due to climate change. If we do that, one thing that happens is that there's a shift in the sorts of microbes in the soil that use ammonium, or ammonia actually, as a food. And they produce nitrate from that ammonia. And nitrate's an important plant food. And the shift from one type to another type results in dominance of an organism that is a very, a very efficient and sort of sloppy producer of nitrate. And so much of the nitrogen in the soil becomes nitrate and then gets lost, leaches out of the soil before plants can use it. So essentially this shift of microbes from one type to another opens up a drain in the ecosystem through which nitrogen is lost. And that has important implications for how plant communities might respond to global change. That we might end up with nitrogen lost into water, into aquifers, and into streams from plant communities.
So is there anything from those conclusions that you want to advocate for in particular in terms of the kinds of measures people or governments can issue to preserve this I guess the nitrogen?
Well, I haven't been very involved in policy, but what this science I think does is it reinforces the idea that has been developed through studies of plant communities primarily, but also animals, that climate change has the potential to greatly impact ecological systems. So not only these large sort of charismatic forms of life that most people study, but also the smallest forms of life. And that can have incredible implications for how ecological systems work. So in a way it magnifies, I think, the importance of addressing climate change, coming up with ways to mitigate its effects.
So I'd like to just shift focus for a moment. Before we went on the air, we talked about some of the work you've done in the past. I don't know if you're interested in speaking about that.
Well, certainly.
In Israel and Jordan, and give people an idea of sort of what scientists or microbiologists such as yourself, how they might be involved in the peace process.
Certainly. So I'm interested not only in environmental science and microbiology, but the use of science to promote peace. And I was able to be involved with the project when I was at Stanford. Its explicit goal was just that, to use science and cross-cultural exchange of scientists as a way to promote peace. And this project was based in Israel and Jordan. It's a project funded by the Bridging the Rift Foundation in New York. And what this foundation has done is to work with the Israeli and Jordanian governments to create a bubble, they call it, a piece of land in the Arava Desert that's half was in Israel and half was in Jordan, and now it's its own entity, so without a border.
Really?
It belongs both to Jordan and to Israel. It's kind of a Vatican for science, so I think about it. So the idea is that students would come in from Jordan and eventually from other Arab countries, and also from Israel, to train at the center. And once they're there, they have free passage to either Jordan or Israel, and they would train together in science, initially with a very regional focus, but then more broadly. And I was a part of the academic steering committee and wrote with Israeli and Jordanian scientists the first proposal to train students jointly. And we focused on the Dead Sea, so as an environmental resource that both Jordan and Israel have. And especially we focused on trying to figure out what lives in the Dead Sea, what the biodiversity is of that body of water. And it was an amazing experience to work directly with both Israeli and Arab students in Israel and Jordan, in the field and laboratories, and watch those connections being made across the cultural and political rifts.
Do you have some anecdotes to share with us about that? I mean, how people kind of went into it, how they came out of it? I guess, was everyone sort of well disposed from the very beginning, or did you actually see, sort of barriers fall as you work together?
definitely saw barriers fall. It was a politically popular idea on the Israeli side of the border, but it was very controversial on the Jordanian side. Even though they had strong advocates, there was also a segment of the population that was very uncomfortable, uneasy with this idea of working directly with Israelis. So the Jordanians really had a huge hurdle to overcome. Mm-hmm. And watching that happen, and as you imagine, first through humor, and then eventually through science, I think the fact that they had a common goal to try to understand the ecology of this particular shared environmental resource made it easier for them to get over the historical and cultural divide. I'm trying to think of a particular anecdote that was funny. Well, there was, I think what I found most interesting is wherever we went, there was a security detail that went with us, both Jordanian and Israeli army. And they, of course, as you could imagine, had the greatest kind of divide initially. And seeing them both on our research vessel in the Dead Sea, tossing and turning on this windy, very buoyant sea and being ill over the side together was an incredibly sort of cohort-building moment, I think, when they found commonality in their dislike of field science in the Dead Sea. So that was one example of how they came together through science.
So given your experience with this particular experiment, as it were, what kind of future do you see for this? How would you see this if you had ways to develop this? What kind of ideas might you have?
Well, I think it's a wonderful model. Just that finding common interests in groups that have otherwise, cultural, political barriers, I think is a wonderful way to build connections across these rifts. And I think science is one area where people lose themselves. As a scientist, that's what I love about science. Is I lose myself in the question and the curiosity, and when you lose yourself, then you in a way also set aside your political and cultural baggage. And I think in any activity people could do together where you have a chance to lose yourself in the company of others, I think has the potential to build these kinds of bridges. So whether that's art or science or what have you.
Well, that's worth a lot more thought. You talk about evolution, and again, we talked before the show on some of the changes in thinking about evolution. Would you like to talk about some of those, and particularly if they do, how they might impact on the kind of work that you do?
Well, I think evolution's gone through a couple of transitions in how evolutionary biologists think about positive interactions among organisms, so cooperation, for example. There was a period of I think historically one can look back and say very sloppy thinking on the part of biologists about how cooperation could evolve in communities, and then a period of time where there was a reaction to that, and evolutionary biologists concluded that the evolution of cooperative interactions should be and has been very rare, and that competition is really, and negative interactions is really the norm.
Excuse me, just for interrupting you. Competition, you mean viewing life or organisms in competition with each other?
Organisms in competition with each other.
That was the prevalent view.
Absolutely. With a few exceptions, but that really was the prevalent view, and it comes from evolutionary models based on Darwinian evolution, that it's difficult to imagine a stable situation where cooperation could evolve and not be subject to cheating, to the evolution of organisms that take advantage of the cooperators but not contribute to the common good. Right. And that's been demonstrated theoretically and experimentally as well. And that sort of led to the idea that cooperation should be quite rare. And now there's another transition happening, I think still very rigorous in its thinking, but it's been asking, well, what are the conditions under which one would expect cooperation to evolve? And studying that directly. And that's led to a little bit of an expansion of the view that cooperation should be quite rare, into one where cooperation is likely under certain circumstances.
Under certain circumstances, but still, where does that cooperative theory fit into the orthodoxies today? I mean, what percentage of biologists sort of fit into this cooperative model of biology? Or is it fair to even say that? Or does everybody just have a little bit of everything?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the cooperative model of biology.
Well, no, what I mean is seeing life and seeing traits selected for cooperation rather than the Darwinian idea that what is selected for is basically the survival of the fittest. So that's what gets selected for, as opposed to traits that would encourage cooperation, maybe even altruism. I don't know.
So I think that most evolutionary biologists hold that view, but it's still a very Darwinian view. So I want to be clear, this isn't a kind of a challenge to Darwinism, but but more of an expansion of it.
I see.
So it's still fitness is still important, and certainly the most fit organisms go on to produce more offspring. Their genes are more prevalent in the next generation. But now the idea of fitness is more inclusive. It includes not only yourself, but in certain circumstances, other organisms that you interact with.
Right.
And exploring what those circumstances are, I think, is a very exciting area of evolutionary biology, and much more popular now than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, again, we spoke earlier about the Dalai Lama and his interest in science. Did any of that stuff come up when you heard him speak at Stanford those few years
It didn't,
ago?
unfortunately, but I certainly wished I'd had the opportunity to ask him those questions. So the questions that came up for him were ones, as we discussed, of Western psychology, neuroscience, neurobiology in particular, and also physics, especially I think the origins of life and those sorts of questions. But I'd love to ask him his views on the evolution of cooperation.
Well, it just struck me that since Buddhism is so emphasizing so much the interdependence of all things, that we may have a moment, in which Buddhism and evolutionary science have this moment
of intersection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the great all of things. So before we're not going to have time to do this, but in 30 seconds,
Sure.
Tell us about undergraduates and what their relation to your research in 20 seconds now.
Sure, 20 seconds. One thing I want to emphasize is, as you mentioned in my intro, I taught at Stanford for 8 or 9 years, and I enjoyed that very much. But one of the things I've noticed about coming to Oregon is I really love teaching Oregon undergraduates. They are passionate and absolutely fearless. So I've been able to try things teaching that would have been very difficult, I think, at Stanford. So.
And on that note, that sort of Pac-10 aperçu, I'm afraid we'll have to come back and ask you to reflect on the question I asked at a later time.
Okay.
So thank you so much for being with us.
It's been a pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
We've been speaking with Brendan Bohannan of the Center for Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and the Department of Biology at the University of Oregon. Thanks for watching.